Dominique. So tonight we're going to hear Shirley Tillotson, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of King's College in the History Department of Dalhousie. She is the 2019 recipient of the Governor General's History Award for Scholarly Research for her book, Give and Take, The Citizen Taxpayer and the Rise of Canadian Democracy, which, as mentioned, you can acquire. So this is obviously a very special moment, not just for Shirley, but also, I think, for us at the Ottawa Historical Association. And I think Greg would probably agree with me that over the course of this association, this would mark something of an epitome in terms of the quality and excellence of the presentations and the type of people that have been speaking for us. And some of that, I think, may come from Dominique being our president, but also the fact that I think this may be the first time we've had a distinguished speaker from away. And so I want to thank the CHA who sponsored this deeply, and then also mention a little bit of this also being a special moment for the Canadian Historical Association, the national and professional body that represents Canadian historians. So I've got here the intersections, and you'll note on the back cover a lovely photograph announcing this award to Shirley, which certainly marks an important moment, both for the association and for her, in terms of recognition of decades of dedicated research and discipline. And then I'd like to point out the Canadian Historical Review, which is the publication, one of the publications put out by the CHA. And this is in fact the 100th volume. And inside, if you open it up, you will discover an article by Shirley. And in fact, it is the Canadian Historical Review of 100 years. And one of the things that I was most impressed by as I worked my way through that was the kind of intellectual framework that she brought to that topic, which I think took those of us who work in small topical areas out of our narrow little silos to a higher level and a framework that allowed us to look at many topics in a way that wasn't perhaps so narrow and petty as some of us have maybe engaged in. So I think it took us to a higher level, and I think that's what scholarship is all about. And I know that she got an email from a distinguished professor to talk about the even-handedness of it, and I think that that's a sign of maturity in the profession and people communicating with each other in a meaningful way. And I think that that's really why her scholarship is so exemplified. Now you're going to notice a big improvement in the prose, because from here on I'm going to be reading her words. The mystique of money is about power, both to hide and to reveal. In tax rhetoric, money numbers, percentages, rates, dollar amounts can be used to misrepresent reality. But studying money can also reveal the very bones of social and political order. Using examples from her recent book, Give and Take, on Canada's 20th century tax history, and from the Dalhousie University's inquiry about its connections to race and slavery in the 1810s. Tillotson will explore both sides of the mystique of money, and especially its relationship to systems of racial power. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Shirley.
Thank you, Isabel. Kind introduction, and Dominique and Isabel for organizing and hosting the Ottawa Historical Association and the Canadian Historical Association for bringing me here tonight and giving me such an odd set of an odd request that it actually got me to think in a new way about my research. I hadn't thought of doing the combination that I'm going to do tonight. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. I also want to apologize to Lyndon for having misrecognized him, former Dalhousie student, who I thought was someone I knew from the Department of Finance. Great to see an audience of young and old profs, students, and people who I may well meet after the talk's over. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments on what I'm going to talk about today. So people are very weird about money, and they're even weirder about taxes. There's a lot of intensity there, a lot of emotional intensity. And as with many emotionally intense subjects, one of the things that you can do as a historian is try to demystify it, try to help people to understand how they work. People often think they won't understand tax or be interested in tax because of the numbers. They just think it's going to be tables and rates and percentages and horrible things that are not immediately transparent. And yet, as Isabel said in her introduction, I want to suggest that those numbers actually are so revealing that even if we use them sparingly in our communications, we need to actually investigate them deeply in our research. But the book, Give and Take, which I'm going to be talking about as one of the two angles of view today, is a book that I pitched as a cultural history of taxation. And it was my perception from studying charitable fundraising and other earlier projects that there was something in the ideas of obligation, the ideas of coercion, the ideas of luxury. There's a bunch of cultural content which every one of you, as ordinarily competent navigators of daily culture, can understand. You don't need the money to do everything that's involved in tax history. Okay, so first I'm going to give you a little sketch of both what I mean in cultural history of taxation, and also a bit of a sketch of the Lord Dalhousie panel on race and slavery, which was the other project I was asked to speak about tonight. After having introduced both of those subjects, I'm going to pull out an example from each to try to illustrate both the cultural content of the tax history there and just a couple of ways that I get at the money in what I hope will be an accessible way. And I'm going to conclude by sharing some thoughts about how the earlier part of the talk might shed some light onto contemporary issues. One, the proposals for the taxation of wealth, and the other proposals about reparations for slavery. I used to object to being asked to talk about the present after a history talk. But as soon as I started going out giving talks about tax, immediately people expected me to, after the talk, say, and here's how we should reorganize our tax system. Way above my pay grade. But, you know, I have come over the course of talking about that book to think more about how what we as historians contribute to contemporary conversations about politics. And so, kicking and screaming, I've been dragged into the 21st century. So, okay, give and take. Just 3 short examples of the kind of thing I mean by cultural history of taxation. One is a legal case fought in the 1920s by representatives of the provincial government of Quebec against the Ministry of National Revenue, arguing that in some respects the federal income tax was not constitutionally copacetic. It's a legal history topic. It's part of chapter 3, but what I would say I draw from it as its cultural content is that you can see there, I think, a really important moment in the embittering of the relationships between the political classes in the province of Quebec and their peers, including within the Liberal Party, government within their own party in that period. So it helps to explain something of the political culture as it's developing at that moment. There's also aspects of culture that are about the culture of daily life. So a luxury tax that was proposed in the federal budget of 1920 was struck down, and part of what made the Department of Finance choose struck down, I say, just withdrawn, made the Department of Finance decide to abandon that one, was the outrage of both retail merchants and their allies, the organized womanhood of Canada and the National Council of Women, who really disputed the boundary between luxury and necessity that was drawn in the list of scheduled items in that luxury tax. Again, cultural content. Department of Finance had one idea of what was a luxury. Housewives of Canada had quite another. Finally, in terms of just these short illustrations, we have this idea, I encountered it time and time again as I told people about this project, that Canadians were cheerful taxpayers, that unlike those crazy Americans, we understood what was what and stepped up and did our bit. And I'm sorry to say that there's a lot of evidence against that in the book, although there's some for it. But I think I found the smoking gun of where that cheerful taxpayer story was created in the 1930s, at really exactly the time when President Roosevelt was going on major high-profile campaigns against tax evaders like a former Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. In Canada, our Department of Finance, Department of National Revenue was saying, nothing to see here. Canadians pay their income tax. They're honorable and patriotic men, except for the 12% who are women. So the book talks about how that sort of public relations work. Again, a kind of cultural concept was performed for tax. So I hope that gives you some idea of what I mean by, in general, by a cultural history of taxation. Now, the other thing that Dominic says, oh, we want you to come and talk about your book. Could you talk a little bit about the Lord Dalhousie history of race and slavery, too? And I thought, okay, that's a stretch goal, how to put these two topics together in one paper. But it turned out, as I say, I think it was interesting for me and quite productive. So the Lord Dalhousie panel on race and slavery was struck as part of the university's 200th anniversary of its first having been chartered in 1818. And at roughly the same period, Lord Dalhousie was the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. He came in October 1816, left in April 1820, so 3.5 years. Just before he came, a group of refugees came to Halifax, to Nova Scotia. Formerly enslaved people, men and women and family and their children from the Chesapeake region of the United States. And during the War of 1812, they had been encouraged to join the British forces in return for encouragement as settlers in British colonies. And some of the men of that community became the feared colonial Marines that were part of the attack on Washington. Those refugees, they're known as the Black Refugees, War of 1812, were part of the community of Nova Scotia and of the Halifax area as Lord Dalhousie was trying to make his decisions as governor about how to improve settlement in the province. The guy illustrated here, we wouldn't have Lord Dalhousie on the cover, is Gabriel Hall, who came as a 12-year-old and succeeded as a farmer. This is him in his 80th year. And we wanted to talk about the relationship between Lord Dalhousie's founding of the university and these formerly enslaved people who he called a burden, constitutionally idle, slaves by habit and education. It was clear that he partook in the kind of white supremacist, they won't work unless we make them, culture of his day. So that was our charge as the Lord Dalhousie's Committee on Race and Slavery, to explore how his attitudes translated, if they did, into any kind of discriminatory treatment and disadvantageous treatment to the refugees, and to find out if there was any connection between the refugees and the founding of the college. So the college has, as part of its kind of myth, the idea that we are a university of exceptional tolerance and inclusiveness, because Lord Dalhousie's idea was that instead of being an Anglican college only, like the University of King's College then existing, Dalhousie would admit dissenters. It would admit, maybe even Catholics. So it was, a universally welcoming institution. Well, maybe not so. But certainly from that notion, today's present college takes something of an inspiration to say that it is a university that aims to have a broader view of inclusiveness. So those are the two projects that I want to draw from in my examples tonight. So one of the things that I began to think about the more I listened to Canadians talk about taxation in the archives was the idea that of what I call the assessment imaginary. That is the idea of, not entirely based on any sort of research or evidence, but a kind of hopeful or despairing view of what there was by way of taxable wealth, income, resources in the country. The assessment imaginary. Part of that is the idea of free riders. Now, there's no question that in any collectively pursued object and collectively financed object, there are people who try to get the benefit of the project without contributing as much as others do, or with any luck, even nothing. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about free riders. The notion that there is some class of people out there who are getting something for nothing, not doing their fair share. Unlike us, the good, worthy people. The free rider always has the kind of self-congratulatory story as a paired item. So it's within tax, the free rider idea not only sweetens the self-esteem of the us, but it also sometimes generates plausible but arguably magical ideas about where the money needed for public life is going to come from. It's from them. There's the saying, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that guy behind the tree. Yeah, of course we need more tax, but it's like, not me, not you, him. So there's always this concept of the free rider, but I would suggest it's a historical one. It's one where who the free riders are imagined to be changes historically and with cultural change. So in 1935, I have a great example of arguably the federal taxing authority not giving in to the free rider imaginary. After all, the taxing authority kind of actually has to know where the money is rather than just to make it up. And they got a letter, and they got letters, plural, of suggestions from the public about how to raise more money for what were the many urgent federal spending needs. Now, the feds had been working hard to improve tax collection since about 1927, when the whole customs and excise thing blew up and it was clear that corruption penetrated every angle of the federal revenue apparatus. And between 1926 and 1931, the income tax had been rearranged so that its levels of exemption were higher. So more lower income people were let off. Now, I'm sure you all know the story that, the First World War income tax was a tax on the rich, no poor people paid it, and it's true that no poor people paid it, But, you know, the labor aristocracy paid it, like the men who worked in the train crews, and people who were, you know, maybe at the low end of the real estate business rather than the high end also paid it. So it actually had a bit more of a middle class incidence. And before 1926 and after 1931, it went quite far down into the middle class pay scale, especially for childless people, unmarried people, where the personal exemptions, which had been quite generous, were small. But in 31, they'd started to, they dropped the exemptions, and they did again for 32. And so by 1935, the exempt income for a single person was only $1,000. For married, it was $2,000, down from $1,500 and $3,000. Anyway, numbers you don't need. Except to say, a whole bunch of people who had been relieved of an income tax obligation in 1926 had been reintroduced to it in 1931, and that made them unhappy, and the further enhanced enforcement efforts. There were people who were looking to find someone else to pay the income tax. So a proposal comes in from one of these, among these many ones, in 1935, and the suggestion there was to deny any exempt income to an alien, someone who wasn't a British subject and who had been in the country for less than 5 years. This was kind of cruel. It meant that really quite poor people were being asked to pay an income tax on the first dollar of their income. So what did the Department of Finance guy say to, oh well, let me, no, okay, sorry, before I tell you the good thing about Ken Eaton. So what does this mean? I say people are being taxed on the first dollar, but you may, if you know any tax history, think, well, the rates were very low. But let's look at, see, this is where I think you need to look at the numbers to understand how cruel it was. On an annual income of say, $500, which was not an uncommon level of working class pay, $9 a week, a single earner would have to come up with $15. And you think, that's not much, just $15 in the spring, you know, to pay their tax bill. It wasn't being deducted at source. He needed to save in advance for this. So, you know, you had to save in a fairly disciplined way if you were going to not find yourself with a debt to the federal government. The math works out to 28 cents a week you need to put aside out of your $9. Again, not so much. But think about the opportunity cost. I thought, what's that in relationship to the cost of flour? And it turns out that you can get flour for about 20 loaves of bread out of that 28 cents a week. So it's an appalling proposal to tax someone at that level of income, even of those small numbers. So, and a tax of similar weight that had been introduced in British Columbia in 1931 had triggered a storm of outrage and defeated the government. So there's no puzzle why people would have gotten a little weird about that tax. But Kenneth Eaton, who was the first tax economist who had just been hired by the Department of Finance in 1934, was given this proposal, and the minister asked him, you know, tell us what you think about this, Mr. Eaton, Dr. Eaton, and he was just caustic about it, he says. Proposal will be costly to administer and enforce, so many small incomes, mobile people traveling looking for work, and paltry in revenue. This is not a rich tax base from which we can solve our revenue problems. Worse, he said, the proposal wasn't really about revenue, it was about hatred of immigrants. I love this quote. He is a foreigner, let's heave a brick at him. That's what Ken Eaton thought was the attitude in the proposal of the tax on immigrants. Now, whether Eaton, who was a son of rural Nova Scotia, knew it or not, the notion that immigrants were bad income taxpayers was already well established by the mid-30s. Very soon after the war income tax was introduced in 1917, you see in a 1919 public opinion survey in Toronto, the question, who was likely to be dodging the municipal income tax of Toronto? And the answer was immigrants. And doctors, it must be said. Okay. So immigrants were seen as mobile sojourners who kept their wages in a money belt and sent most of what they earned out of the country. They were seen as hard to tax, even by people who knew something about tax enforcement. So in 1935, when Canadians were casting around for someone else behind the tree who would have income that tax collectors had so far failed to tap, the guy who wrote into the Department of Finance was speaking for a larger body of nativist opinion when he said aliens would fit the bill. So that's an example of the free rider imaginary at work. There's no real pot of money there, but it's so satisfying to say, get it from the immigrants. Right? There are several other objects you will recognize. The Indians don't pay taxes as another example of the race-inspired free rider imaginary. But actually, even in the 20s and 30s, there were indigenous people who earned enough money to have an income tax obligation. Steel workers, iron workers, like this Ganyangahaga man, Mohawk man, pictured here, earned enough money to pay income tax. And there was a big argument in the 20s and 30s about whether income that was earned by people who lived on reserve, but earned off reserve, like the Ganstagia people who worked across the river in Lachine at Dominion Bridge, whether they owed money or whether it was only money that was earned on reserve that was tax exempt. Chapter 5 is mostly about that. I won't give you all the details, but I wanted to signal it as another important example, and one that helped to reinforce the toxic problem for First Nations people of Department of Justice says this, Department of Indian Affairs says that, Department of National Revenue says the other thing. There were all these federal bureaucrats who were contradicting each other in advice to Indigenous people on income tax questions in the interwar years. And in 43, 44, this guy Jules Siwi, along with John Tutusas, Plains Cree, and Andrew Paul from the West Coast Salish, summoned national chiefs together 43 and 44 and formed the North American Indian Brotherhood. Two issues: conscription and income taxation. Right? So it's that struggle, that issue was part of what founded this organization that became later the Assembly of First Nations. Okay, so my general point here, tax is about race in a lot of surprising ways. And there's more of it in the book. Francophobia shows up in tax fights in the 50s. You get anti-Oriental politics in British Columbia right through to the 50s. Harassment of black poll taxpayers in New Brunswick. And there's some other stories that I'm starting to explore in Chatham. In all of this racialized tax talk, what we're seeing is the free rider imaginary at work. So now let's switch centuries, switch topics, but I promise it's going to come back together in some way at the end. So many of you may know the American Universities and Slavery projects and the sorts of stories that they've been generating about, like Georgetown, 272 enslaved men and women sold by the Jesuit order, plantation workers in 1838 to keep the university afloat. And stories of University of Glasgow, merchants in the West Indies trade, donating massive sums to found the University of Glasgow, recently now repaid in some measure to the University of West Indies. In our case,